Like, hopefully everyone will be able to hear. So if you can't, just make some noise or give us a hand. There's yummy snacks over there. Please help yourself. Pepperoni rolls, just saying. And of course, all the books that you'll hear about are for sale at the table right next door. You can purchase those at any time during the reading. The authors will be definitely available afterwards to talk with you and to sign your books. So let's get started. I'm Kathryn Moore, and I am the president of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, one of the many helpers who have made the Blair Centennial this weekend a reality. And I am super that you're here. I'm going to read to you a little statement about the Centennial itself. We're a partner event. So this event is being held in partnership with the Battle of Blair Mountain Centennial, which is taking place in many communities across the state of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Virginia over multiple days. The Centennial aims to commemorate the significance of the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921 and the rich history of the Southern West Virginia coal fields. It is also a way to memorialize the brave men and women who fought for the civil rights and labor rights of miners and their families 100 years ago. Finally, the event is a celebration of the ideals of inclusiveness, diversity, and equity. So before we jump into our panelists, I wanted to just take a minute and ground us in the space that we're in right now. We are, of course, on Capitol Street in downtown Charleston. Back in 1921, so I think folks perhaps who live in Charleston even aren't aware that the mine wars were happening in the coal fields around the city, but there was also a lot of activity happening right here. In fact, right where we're sitting, to be honest. So I'm going to point out one landmark, and then I think others have some thoughts as well. So everyone knows Ellen's ice cream, right? Yeah. I used to work there as a kid. And if you notice, the sign up top says Lowenstein and Sons. Well, back in 1912, actually it was 1913 at this point, you'll hear more about this from Ginny. But the 1912-1913 Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike was raging just up the river from us in the Upper Kanawha Valley. And how many have heard of the Bull Moose Special? The story of the Bull Moose Special. Okay, if you haven't, just sit tight and Jenny's going to tell you more about it. But for those of you who do know, Quinn Morton, one of the coal operators who was kind of leading the charge of the Bull Moose Special, before he had rounded up his posse and got on the train, he went to Lowenstein and Sons department store, hardware store, and bought a case of rifles and all of his ammunition. And along with the sheriff of Kanawha County, loaded that into the Bull Moose Special and trekked up to Paint Creek, where a tragedy was about to occur. But those guns were supplied from right here. And Jenny, do you want to add something? Yes.
Louder. That's good. Is that good? All right. Yeah. Several years ago, I was doing some research trying to figure out where certain places were that were in existence back in 1912. And one of the places, the place that Mother Jones stayed when she comes to Charleston was Fleetwood Hotel. And I did a lot of hunting and looking at old maps and so forth, and I pretty much came to the conclusion of not 100%, but I'm almost probably 95% sure that the Fleetwood Hotel used to stand in that empty space there just down from Lowenstein's, where I guess is the parking lot now. So that's sort of an interesting little nugget. It's Fleetwood was always where Mother Jones would come and stay. It's her favorite place to hang out and away from the upper class people.
And I remember reading a little detail that she had beers delivered up to her room.
Yes,
violation.
yes, that was after she got out of prison.
After she got out of prison, a company spy was like 3 beers have been delivered to Mother Johnson's room.
And then, if you read the book, on the first page, on the very first page of the book, talks about how Mother Jones came into Charleston on the train, and she stopped at the train station across the river. And she looked across and she could see, you know, the city that, you know, it had been several years, 10 years probably since she last been here. And she noticed some new things, and one of them was a brand new office building. And that office building is that 12-story building right at the end of Capitol Street, kind of down on the river. It's now, I think, a radio station and maybe some other things. But, you know, she kind of saw that progress and a brand new addition to the city. So those are just kind of some cool, interesting things to note.
I'm next, apparently. All right, a couple of things really quickly. There's a very famous picture of Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney standing in front of the UMWA District 17 sign. If you follow my words history, that picture was taken right around the corner because UMWA District 17 headquarters was on Summer Street, right around the corner near the boulevard. So that picture was taken there because that's where district headquarters was at that time period. But also, and something that I think is better, this is Capitol Street, right? Why is it Capitol Street? The Capitol is on this street. In 1921, the Capitol was at the corner here. Right around the corner, that was the Capitol over to there. The Capitol, by the way, burnt in early 1921. They still had a lot of guns and ammunition that they had confiscated during the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, and that was one of the things that really that kept them from putting the fire out. But what's significant about the fact that the Capitol is here in relation to what we're talking about today is on August 7th, 1921, 1 week after Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers were murdered on the McDowell County Courthouse steps, around 5,000 miners congregated right here at the Capitol steps, and they brought a list of demands to Governor, and Governor Morgan wouldn't even see them. Here, and Bill Slippers was here, and Fred Mooney was here, and Frank Keeney was here. And after they were rejected by the governor and weren't even allowed to have an audience with him, that's when my great-grandfather said, it's right at this corner, the only way you can get your rights is with a high-powered rifle. And then told the miners to go home and await the call to march. So 100 years ago, a month ago, 100 years ago, this place was chock full of very angry miners. And you can only imagine what the tension would have been like, what the atmosphere would have been like. Not quite as jovial maybe as today, but it's important to know that these things happen right here as well.
Okay, so that's where we are. And without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our first reader. Each reader is going to read for about 5 minutes. And then I've got some questions, and I'm sure you all have some questions. So as we go, you know, and you have questions, just know that there will be time to ask them, okay? So we're starting this afternoon with Anne T. Lawrence, here in the middle. Anne is a professor of management emerita at San Jose State University, and she currently serves as a chair of the Case Research Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provides fellowships to early career scholars for training in case research and teaching. But before all of that, Anne was a student at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, studying sociology and history. And in 1972, the Miner's Voice, a labor newspaper published by the Appalachian Public Interest Journalism Group, received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to encourage young people's interest in the humanities. They proposed conducting an oral history with the men and women who had participated in the unionization of the coal fields of Central Appalachia during the 20s and 30s. The Miner's Voice was a mouthpiece for the Miners for Democracy movement, which sought to root out corruption in the UMWA. They hired Anne, who was studying at Swarthmore, to direct the project. She moved here to Charleston, West Virginia, And from June to October of 1972, she traveled through the coal fields of central and southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and southwestern Virginia, seeking out and interviewing mostly retired miners and their wives about their union experiences. She focused on a few key historical events and periods, including the Battle of Blair Mountain. And the result of that project was a very thick typescript book, a report that about. And today you can buy right over there a brand new book that just came out from WVU Press, which is an abridged version of that oral history project, focusing oral history is taken in other states, and those are also available. The originals are available at George Washington University for listening. So without further ado, help me to welcome Anne Warren.
Thanks, Kathryn. I want to say I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled that this book is finally being published now almost 50 years after I wrote it. For the older folks in the audience, I'll just say it's never too late to get your book published. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence in our audience here today of several members of the Miners for Democracy. This was the reform movement in the Miners Union, which fought successfully in 1972 for union democracy and workers' rights in the coal fields. And I'm very thrilled that they can come out and join me and the others here today. I've selected short excerpts of 6 of the interviews that appear in the book, and I'll read them for you now. Grace grew up in Cabin Creek. In this passage, she recalls the actions of the National Guard and private mine guards during the strike of 1912-13. Many of the leaders of the Miners' March of 1921 came from Union families in this region. These are Grace's words. They even threw one woman out of her house. She was a neighbor to my grandmother who had just had a baby. It was the fall of the year and real cold. They searched your houses day and night for guns. Of course, the strikers had guns, but they were smart enough to keep their artillery hidden. My uncle, he had a .44 pistol. He took a Sears Roebuck catalog, which was about 5 inches thick, and cut a hole out of the middle of it and laid it out on top of his mother's sewing machine, right there with a .44 in the middle of it. Well, they searched everything in the house, went into every drawer, dumped out mattresses, everything, but they didn't find no .44 pistol. Willard Smith, Matewan, West Virginia. Willard was a coal miner and union supporter who witnessed the shootout at the railway station in Matewan between Baldwin Phillips detectives and Sheriff Sid Hatfield and other union supporters on May 19, 1920. At the time, he was walking along the track with a friend. Them thugs came out to catch train 16. They had their guns all put together and their shotguns still buckled on. It was about 100, maybe 200 feet away. We decided we'd go over and see what the issue was. As soon as we got on the railroad tracks, we heard a shot fired. It wasn't 5 seconds between that fire and 500 more. I crawled under some cars. We stayed there until it all quieted down. When it did, we went out and around the other end of the station. There was a fellow coming around the corner of the station to where we were. He had 2 big guns and was wearing a pair of overalls. He emptied those 2 guns and then filled them up just as fast as anyone could. Bring on some more, he hollered. We took care of them, we'll get the others. He was one of our men. It was dangerous out there, I'll tell you that. Henry Clay Petrie Jr., Lawson, West Virginia. Blair fought in the Battle of Blair Mountain when he was 16 years old, alongside his older brother, Bill Petrie, who later became an officer of UMWA District 17. After the battle, to escape prosecution, he rode the rails to Wyoming. Our plan was to go down to Logan, Mingo, McDowell, and get those men organized. Either that or stop them from producing coal. Our aim was to get them fellows organized and get them a contract, because then they'd get out the same amount of money for their work we was getting from ours, and we could all work and live. Well, the only way we was going to organize them was to mobilize and march in there. And I mean to tell you, that's what we did. We mobilized and we marched in there. Now, let me tell you, we was in there for business. It wasn't no Camp Buster parade. Meanwhile, in Logan County, miners were living and working under the iron-fisted control of anti-union sheriff Don Chapin, who was paid by the coal miners. I interviewed George Swain, Charleston, West Virginia. George was a boss for the Island State Coal Company in Logan County and a close friend of Sheriff Don Chapin. And I want to mention here that I made a real point in doing these, collecting these oral histories, to talk to people on all sides of this conflict. These are George's words. Don Chapin had a secret service. In fact, I worked for him for a while as a secret service agent. I'd listen around in my mind and see if any of my boys were talking about striking or anything like that. We recorded if they did, and the mine owner would fire them real quick. We never said that was the reason, though. We'd always say that they had missed a day, or their work wasn't of very good quality, or something like that. And I feel I have to add this little bit from my interview with George Swain, where he spoke about Frank Keeney, because Frank's great grandson, Frank Keeney, is sitting here with me. This was a boss talking about Frank Keeney, who was the leader of the Miners' March and later of Union District 17. Now, I have to admit, I had some admiration for Frank Keeney, the president of District 17. He didn't have no education. Dewey Browning, Switzer, West Virginia. Dewey, a Union sympathizer, was working as a coal miner in Logan County when the Battle of Blair Mountain broke out. Like many working miners, he was conscripted by the sheriff to fight against the Union forces. Don Chapin and his boys were coming around beating the bushes and getting everyone rousted out to fight. It was just fight or go to jail, that was about it. Well, I was in a real fix. So I thought me up a smart trick. I went on into Logan and made like I was planning on going up there to fight the rednecks, and I wanted a pistol and a high-powered rifle too to do the job. But instead of taking them guns up on the mountain, I went back to Cow Creek where my people was at. On the way back, I ran into one of Don's deputies. He says to me, "Dewey, where are you going with them guns? You should be up on the mountain." I thought quickly and answered, "Don appointed me the official guard for this camp." "Oh, then go ahead," he said. The coal miners in Logan and other counties in southern West Virginia finally gained union recognition in 1933 after New Deal legislation gave them the legal right to organize. I interviewed Ernest Blankenship, White's Edition, West Virginia. Ernest was a coal miner who joined the union in Logan County at that time. It was just about heaven when we finally got the union. A lot of things went to changing right away. It used to be you had to do all of your shopping at the company store. There was no choice in the matter. Peddlers would come around, and they'd chain off the road leading to the camp so they couldn't come in. Really, that is facts. Now we got that changed. So you could shop anywhere you chose, and that helped keep the prices of food down. And if you had a grievance, you could take it to the mine committee, and they'd take it up with the bosses and straighten it out. Honey, I really know what the union is. All of us old fellows do, the ones that fought for it. I'm 72 years old. It's been a long life. I'm not well. But maybe of all the things that really keep me going, the union. Thank you.
say mic drop, but I'm hoping the mic doesn't drop. Thank you, Anne. I should mention too that this edition of On Dark and Bloody Ground that just came out has an afterword by United Mine Workers President Cecil Roberts. So you can read his reaction to these oral histories, which contain the words of some of his family members. And I wrote the foreword. So next up we have Ginny Ayers. In 19, we've got some Savage Ayers fans in the crowd. Yes. In 1986, Lon Savage published Thunder in the Mountains, which many of you probably know. Thunder in the Mountains, a very popular history that is now considered a classic account of the battle in the years leading up. When Savage passed away, he left behind an incomplete book manuscript about a lesser-known Mother Jones crusade in Kanawha County, West Virginia. His daughter, Ginny Savage Ayers, drew on his notes and files, as well as her own research, to complete Never Justice, Never Peace. Hold it up. Hold it up. Never Justice, Never Peace. Forward by Lou Martin, the luminary we have in the crowd today. Very nice. This is the first book-length account of the Cabin Creek strike of 1912-13. The book weaves together threads about organizer Mother Jones, United Mine Workers Union, politicians, coal companies, and Baldwin Felts Detective Agency guards, with the experiences of everyday men and women. Ginny Savage Ayers has worked for many years in scientific research and teaching, and she currently resides in Maryville, Tennessee, where she's involved in environmental and social causes. Let's welcome Ginny to the stage.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so appreciative of all the effort that went into organizing and getting this weekend going. And this has been a multi-year effort, thanks to a lot of people with the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum and a lot of other folks. So this is just amazing. I thought I would talk about a particular story. The story of the on Pink Creek. Sorry. That event occurred, and at this point, the strike had been going on, and there had been a lot of bloodshed, a lot of strife. Tensions were high. And there was one particular incident that sort of instigated, I think, or preceded the Bull Moose incident. And that was when a scab miner working on Pink Creek was injured. And that happened a lot. Well, it happened with a lot of the miners, but particularly with the scab miners, because they were not as experienced and didn't have the skills to keep themselves safe. So this one scab miner was badly injured, and the company doctor decided to load him onto a wagon pulled by mules and take him down the creek to the hospital, the Sheltering Arms Hospital at Pratt. And he knew it was going to be risky. The doctor knew they were taking a lot of chances doing this because the miners, all the striking miners were out there with their guns, and a lot of sporadic shooting had been going on. But they set out down the creek, and sure enough, when they got to Holly Grove, some striking miners up hiding in the hills and the trees fired on them. Still, they got the mules into high gear and they sped down the creek and made it to the hospital, but the scab miner did not survive his wounds. So this really kind of upped the tensions a great deal, and everyone was really nervous. And that night was when this plan for the Bull Moose special train to go up the creek, that's when this plan was hatched. So in the chapter that deals with this, it's the chapter titled "Thirsty to Shed Human Blood." And the first part of it deals with the story from the perspective of the operators and the guards and watchmen and the train employees and so forth. And their side of the story, and how it all came about, how the planning and everything, how it all came together. But I'm going to start with the story from the Holly Grove residents' perspective. And yeah, sorry, Holly Grove was a tent colony. So the miners, when they went on strike, most of them were evicted from their cabins, their company-owned houses, and so they would set up tent colonies. Holly Grove had some buildings, some houses, but it was a great deal, mostly tents that the families, the miners and their families stayed in, and they lived through the winter in these tents. So Holly Grove was not a friendly place to be if you were a mine owner or operator. So starts on the night of the Bull Moose shooting. On Thursday night, February 6th, Charlie and Maude Fish entertained some of their friends who had been evicted early in the strike and had moved into a tent. That Jim Youssef, cousin Enoch Farrell, Warnie Fish, Fonzo Willis, Jim Pike, 9 people in all. It was so much fun that Sesko told them as they left, I want you all to come to my house tomorrow night. And they promised they would come to sing songs and play a game of Pedro and Sesko. He and his wife Maude lived in a box-like house with upright painted boards and battens set up on stilts, bricks, and stones, elevated 5 steps from the ground with a cellar that they were trying to fix up. The house was alongside the hill across the creek from the train station at Holly Grove. A swinging bridge connected them with the road and track. Here they lived with their 1-year-old boy Clifford, and Maude was expecting a second. That next night, Friday, September 7th, or Friday, February 7th, Jim Youssef and Enoch Farrell visited Sesko's home about dark as invited. But first they stopped by Charlie and Maude Fish's home. Charlie's rheumatism was bothering him, so he and Maude were staying home. Word had gotten around about the shots fired at Mucklow earlier in the day, and officials had asked the sheriff to come to the rescue of the guards who were trying to, quote, clean up Holly Grove. Enoch advised Maude that she should, quote, take Mr. Fish out of the creek tonight. Enoch and Jim then went on over to the Eastep house for an evening of socializing and listening to the music box, along with friends Jim Pike and Bob and Anderson Fowler. Millard Fillmore Dammer had lived for 10 months in the first tent on the right as you came up the creek to Holly Grove, only a few feet from the railroad. That night, he had crossed the track to visit with his friend U.S. Cantley. He was returning when he saw the engine moving slowly along the track, its headlight burning. He ran across the track in front of it, and just as the engine passed him, he heard 2 toots and the firing started. Bullets were landing so close to him that he thought they might be shooting at him. Soon after the gunfire started from the coach windows, he heard the rapid fire of a machine gun and saw the rocks being picked up. The tents of Ford Holly and W.H. Huffman were in the same area as Dameron's, about 30 feet from the track in the lower part of the village. Holly was sitting in front of the stove, pulling off his shoes, relaxing in the lighted tent he shared with his aunt, when he heard 2 sharp whistles from the train, followed by the shooting. Later, he found 2 bullet holes in the tent, about 3 feet from the ground. Huffman also heard the toot of the train, followed by the shots. Having just gone to bed, he jumped up, pulled on his pants, and ran out, then froze. Bullets were whizzing by him, and the shooting so heavy he was afraid to go on. He dove back into the tent and lay low until the shooting had stopped. Like most of the town's residents, had laid down herself in their three-room weatherboarded home. She heard the train give a low toot at the first hit, and then the shooting started. She ran to where her younger children were sleeping and tried to get them behind the chimney in one of the rooms while her husband tried to shield her. The bullet came through the window, through a partition, cut across a Bible, shattered a chair post, and hit her right foot and penetrated her left foot. The Bull Moose special rolled by the Easton house within 5 minutes after the Fatherman had arrived. Hearing the gunfire, Maud, carrying little Clifford, ran out the kitchen door with neighbor Bessie Willis, trying to get to the cellar. Sesto came around the cellar door from the outside. Maud could barely see his bulk in the darkness. "You women, get in right quick," Sesto yelled at his wife and Bessie. "Get in the cellar." Bullets were hitting around them. Enoch Farrell was trying to help the women reach safety when he was struck in the leg with a bullet. Confusion followed. Maud didn't know her husband had been killed until after the shooting. She heard someone call his name, and he didn't answer. He had been struck in the face, the bullet coming through the building about 6 inches from the floor, according to a Union reporter who visited the cabin the next day. The shooting, described by many as a constant war, continued until the train passed the quarter-mile to the upper end of the town. After the firing ceased, the train kept moving slowly up the creek, not stopping until it reached the switch at Muffalo.
And that armored train that they called the Bull Moose Special, because of who built it, was actually constructed in the Huntington rail yards in the months leading the beginning of the strike. All right, our last reader is Charles B. Keeney. Charles, or Chuck as we call him, is an associate professor of history at Southern West Virginia Community and Technical College. The author of 2 books, he served as president of Friends of Blair Mountain and was a founding member of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. The Road to Blair Mountain, hold it up, hold it up. Woo! Just Came Out is a moving and sometimes harrowing story of Charles Keeney's fight to save this irreplaceable landscape. Beginning in 2011, Keeney, the great-grandson of Frank Keeney, and we also have the grandson of Frank Keeney in the audience too, Chuck's father, led a, yes, thank you. Keeney led a 9-year legal battle, 9-year legal battle to secure the site's placement on the National Register of Historic Places. His book tells a David and Goliath tale worthy of its own place in West Virginia history, a success story for historic preservation and environmentalism. It serves as an example of how rural grassroots organizations can defeat the fossil fuel industry. Let's welcome Chuck.
So, in trying to figure out what I wanted to read, instead of getting into the detail about the actual fight to save Blair Mountain and some of the things that we went through, I decided to answer a question that I get often asked, and that is, what was it like to grow up with a history like this? What was it like to be Frank Keeney's great-grandson? By the way, we have some of Frank Keeney's great-granddaughters here, and one of Frank Keeney's great-great-grandsons here. So we're surrounded by Keeneys. Yeah. So I'm going to read from a couple passages that kind of explain what motivated me and what it was like to grow up with this history, and and that family legacy that more than me and other people that grew up in the coal fields or grew up in Southern West Virginia grew up with. So everywhere I go in life, Frank Keeney's story follows me. The first time I heard his name, I was about 7 years old, and it was Memorial Day weekend. My father's side of the family usually hosted an annual family reunion cookout on the Sunday of this holiday weekend. On this particular year, the cookout took place at my great Aunt Georgie's house in Allen Creek. It was the standard fare, as I recall: hamburgers, cakes, cobblers, pies, potato salad, macaroni salad, hot dogs, coleslaw, and chili for the dogs, and more casserole dishes than you can shake a stick at. No booze. Most of the family are fervent Appalachian Protestants. As the youngest in both my immediate and extended, who I hardly knew, came up to me and told me how much I had grown, or that they had changed my diapers. In order to avoid the hug fest, I went around behind the house and took out a plastic toy army knife I had brought along and practiced throwing the toy blade into a patch of moss on the side of the hill. After a few failed attempts, where the knife simply bounced off the moss, I heard a voice behind me. "You're throwing it all wrong, son." The voice belonged to a large man wearing a white cowboy hat and large sunglasses. And even though he was not my father, he called me son, which was kind of typical where I grew up. The man's name was James Jackson, and he was one of Frank Keeney's grandchildren. At the time, I had no idea who he was. He snatched the knife off the grass. "You're holding the handle. You have to hold it by the blade," he said as he demonstrated the correct throwing motion and handed it back to me. I darted the blade into the moss. James complimented me on the toss, and then he said it was good for me to learn how to throw a knife. "You never know," he said. "You might have a Baldwin Felts thug after you one day." I had no idea what he was talking about and was a little alarmed. What was a Baldwin Felts thug, and why would he be after me? I asked him, and James lowered to one knee so that he could look me in the eye and said, "You're Frank Keeney's great-grandson, and you never heard of the mine guards?" I unleashed a barrage of questions, but the man will not reveal any more details. He simply told me to ask my father, stood up, and walked around the front of the house. I stayed behind, looking up into the woods, trying to absorb the information. A minute or two later, I found my dad hovering over a grill by the picnic shelter in the backyard. I tugged on his t-shirt and blurted out, "Who is Frank Keeney and what is a mine guard?" Dad told me that we was an old lady, and I think it was my great Aunt Ernie, whispered to another in quiet condemnation. I bet it was James who told him. Although confused, I knew enough to understand that something had been swept under the rug. As I grew older and learned much more about Frank Keeney and the mine wars, I found that a great many things were swept under the rug in that last. The simple question I had posed to my father at that picnic would lead me down a lifelong road of inquiry and personal discovery that would direct the trajectory of my scholarly career and activism. At the time, however, I only sensed that whatever happened with this Frank Keeney had cast something of a shadow over the family. As a kid, I only understood the basics. There was a war fought in West Virginia. There were no monuments to this war. No one talked about it. My teachers at school did not know anything about it. But whatever happened, my great-grandfather played a central role in it. I'm skipping a few pages here. Every year or so, as I grew to manhood, strangers approached me and told me, or my father, a Frank Keeney or a mine war story. I shook Frank Keeney's hand at a union rally once. I heard Frank Keeney give a speech once. My great-grandfather fought on Cabin Creek with Keeney. An elderly man once approached me at the Cultural Center in Charleston, asking me if I was Frank Keeney's great-grandson. When I said yes, he told me that his father had gotten him out of elementary school one day to meet Frank Keeney. He said that he attended school in downtown Charleston. One afternoon, his father, who at one time had been a coal miner but had since transitioned to construction work, appeared at his classroom door. His father took him out of school, still in his dirty construction outfit, and walked him a few blocks to a bar. He said that in the bar sat an old man drinking whiskey and smoking a cigarette. The old man, of course, was Frank Keeney. The father introduced his son to Frank. The son, who told me the story many years later, said that Frank smiled, leaned down, shook his hand, and said something funny, and then returned to his drink. His father then took him outside. The son said, "Who was that old man?" His father took him for a walk and told him. Frank Keeney's life story, combined with the obscurity of this history, carried a weight with it that I could never seem to shake. The weight followed me to Logan County in 2009. Teaching at Southern, I felt, would be a good way to honor Frank Keeney's memory and alleviate the persistent sense of responsibility I felt towards my family history. When I began teaching, most of my students had never heard of Blair Mountain and had no idea that a major battlefield lay only a few miles from campus. The irony did not escape me. It's easy to destroy a battlefield when the younger generation does not know it exists. Make no mistake, my students at Southern understood a great deal about the contemporary coal industry. They were often coal miners or coal miners' wives, daughters, and sons. Some of my students worked the mines at night, called the hoot owl shift, and arrived in class covered in coal dust. They certainly held strong feelings about coal and the politics of coal, yet they knew so little of its history. If nothing else, I could change that. However, I would soon find myself doing much more than teaching, as my arrival in Logan coincided with the delisting of the Blair Mountain battlefield from the National Register of Historic Places. Thank you.
All right, that was awesome. Let's give a little round of adjust to get a little shade. So I have questions, but I think I just want to open it up to you all. Does anyone have a burning question right now they would like to ask? Yeah. Speak nice and loud for us.
And let me tell you, it's not easy. So I really appreciate that there's a good conference. And my research is specifically about race in the West Virginia coal fields. These African American miners, state traffic, race strikes. And I was wondering, just because I didn't find much, if there was, if you could speak on that, and also specifically, also, kind of the second question, but related to the first one, how newspapers wrote about some of the press coverage of the big traffic.
So I think the question is, can Ginny speak to the African American involvement in King Creek Cabin Creek strike and how the newspapers at the time were covering the events? So
Great questions. As to the race component, yeah, there were, certainly a number of African-American miners. Some of them had come, were former slaves or children of former slaves that had left the South and come looking for better jobs. And I would also add that it's not just the Black population, but also there were a number of immigrants populations, Italians especially, and Greeks and others that had come. And so there was certainly, that was a big issue, and the issue of prejudice and the issue of trying to divide communities based on their ethnicity. the miners, you know, I mean, they're just like anywhere, there was a certain element, a certain amount of prejudice among the white miners towards the blacks. But there was also an effort, and I think, you know, really pretty successful effort to try to overcome those differences and, you know, see their plight as better. They're better off working together than against each other. Of course, the mine owners like to take advantage of those differences. They would, you know, who's the author that wrote? Yeah, Ron Lewis. Yeah, black coal miners in America, and there are others as well, but he does a really good job of talking about how you know the mine owners would use that as a strategy and try to pit the different racial groups against each other, because that served their purposes. It helped to, you know, keep the miners less unionized, yes, less you know, fighting for the same purpose, and it kind of helped them. They also, you know, there were different in these mining camps. They would set up communities based on their ethnicities as well. There was Banner Hollow, which I think is still there, something community named that. That was, I think that was the Italian community that lived there, and so they, you know, they did to some extent try to maintain their ethnic traditions, but also try to work together, you know, as one to overcome the difficulties of being a miner in those conditions. Your other question was about the newspaper coverage, and so, you know, a great deal of this of the material comes from Charleston Gazette, the Daily Mail, New York Times. I mean, they were, you know, it was reported on all over the country, but of course, most in detail locally. And it was interesting to kind of see the different perspectives, and sometimes it would depend, I found, on the individual reporter as to change over time. You know, they would, for a while, they would write as if they really sympathized with the miners, but then when Mother Jones got, you know, a little out of hand, and they were like, yeah, she needs to go away, she's not doing any good. And there were, I think, some differences between the two main papers, the Gazette and the Daily Mail, as to their slants as well. Seems to me, at least initially, that the Gazette was more favorable towards the miners, but again, that would change over time too. So not a really one, you know, simple answer to that. But there were patterns for sure. That help answer your question?
Yeah, may I ask more than a question?
Sure.
Are there narratives from
There are several anecdotes. You know, I don't know if I want to go to all of them, but there was an incident of a black miner that was beaten. He was mistaken, or he was accused of being a scab. And honestly, I'm not sure whether that's true or not. He may have been, but he was taken for a scab. Whether he was or not, you know, he was unjustly beaten. And this happened, I think, at the train station along the creek. And Mother Jones kind of pretty much came to his rescue. You know, she's not a softie at all, but she pretty much came to his rescue and got him away. And there's also Dan Duclos Chain, who was he was a activist, unionist, and he was in charge of some groups that would go up in the hills, and when the trains would come in bringing the scabs, he would they had this set of signals that they would relay, and whenever there was a scab train coming, they would all be ready and they would start shooting from the mountains down on these scout trains. So Dan Chain was kind of a leader of that gang. 3011, I think that's what it was. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so the question was, what's my response to the history when the fact that my students don't know anything about this history? What's their reaction to it? How do they respond to it? It's something that really challenges their worldviews, because they only have this notion of coal as a benefactor, as something that's wonderful, something that's great. They have the mentality that we should be grateful for the coal companies as opposed to the coal companies being grateful for the resources we have. So they have that view. You should be grateful to the companies. It's the companies that enables you to just have what you do have. And so this gives a different notion to what the coal industry means to West Virginia, what it has meant to West Virginia, and the way they used to treat people. It also helps illuminate notions of unionism and gives them a little bit of insight into that, because many of them have no really concept of what unionism means and how people can benefit from that. For example, we talk about how many people were killed at Blair Mountain is something that we don't know, right? What we do know is that in the decade after Blair Mountain, when the Union was wiped out in West Virginia, they went from over 50,000 Union members in West Virginia to less than 1,000. The decade of the 1920s saw the largest increase or the highest rate of mining deaths in West Virginia history. Over 400 miners a year died in non-union mines. That's over 4,000 miners died in non-union mines in the decade after the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia. Those are casualties. And they don't know about any of that. They don't know that the coal industry used to say the mule was more valuable than the man. So it's eye-opening for them. And I'll tell you one interesting story about that. I had a descendant of one certain Don Chapin who was in my class. And he had no idea. He didn't know anything about his own family history. He didn't know who was great. He knew that he had a Don Chapin who was once a sheriff of Logan. But he had no idea I think that he was related to Chapin, because there's a lot of Chapins. You know how it is in southern West Virginia. It's one of the same last names. It's all relative in West Virginia. But he didn't know anything about his own family past. And he went and asked his family about it. And he came up to me after class one time and he said, "I just want to apologize." I said, "What for? What are you apologizing to me for?" I thought it was because I had a late paper or something. That's usually why I get apologies. But he said, "No, I'm a Chapin. I'm a descendant of John Chapin, and I just want to apologize for what we did to your family." And I was blown away by that, and by so apparently, it does have an impact on them, and hopefully, over time, I call it identity reclamation. Hopefully, over time, that will open some people's eyes.
Do you ever feel unsafe?
Well, I have a book about it that goes into how I felt about it. Well, let me just say this. After, for me, my own personal Rubicon in the whole Blair Mountain thing was when we had our first press conference about it that was televised. In fact, Kat, one of the first times I met you, and one of the first times I met a lot of people that were involved in it. We had a little press conference over at the UA building. Yeah, Gordon Simmons right there. A Red Bandana Award winner, by the way, Gordon. And we were over there and we did the press conference, and I knew once my face was on television, there was no turning back. And for me, once I crossed that, losing was not an option. I have no, I simply can't wrap my mind around the possibility of, for people who say, I'll just do my best and whatever happens, happens. I don't understand that mentality. When I was in it, I was not walking away from this on the losing side. That wasn't going to happen. And so I knew that I was going to have to be all in on it. And I also knew it was going to be dangerous. And after that day, I did the press conference. I went to Logan, taught my classes, taught a night class. A miner who had worked as a surface miner for Massey Energy walked into my office. Big guy, his name's Mike. Walked into my office, he's huge, and said, saw your press conference. I thought, and he said, and I said, well, what did you think of it? And he said, I think you need to watch your back around here. From that time on, he walked me to my car every evening to protect me from the possibility of physical harm. So there were times when I was, a little bit worried about my safety, but I also knew I had people that had my back, and then that comforted me. Thank you for that question.
I want to interject with this question for Anne.
So Anne, I explained a little bit about the background of Anne's project and when she came here in 1972. And I wanted to just ask you a question about what it was like to come here as a stranger, having never been to West Virginia before, I assume, and kind of embedding yourself in that community that you were hoping to document. Were to you? Were people suspicious of you when you asked them about the battle? And sort of how did that play out for you?
Thank you for the question, Kathryn. I am not a West Virginian. I grew up in Massachusetts. I learned from the people I interviewed. I had to work through networks to find people to talk with. I worked through the Miners for Democracy Network. I worked through the Black Lung Association, which had many older members. I worked through volunteers working with VISTA. And I spent a lot of time just sitting with people, getting to know them, and asking them to share their stories, their memories from many years earlier. I'm still not sure why a lot of people did talk to me. I'm just 5 feet tall. I don't think I was too threatening when I knocked on the door. I was a smoker at the time. Blessedly, I'm no longer a smoker, but I carried my cigarettes with me, and I would share cigarettes and sit on people's front porches and just share a cigarette and wait. But I also think that older adults are often very eager to share their stories, their memories. These were very salient memories for the people I spoke with. They were very important events in their lives. And I think they appreciated a young person coming around and asking them about their experiences. I made one other comment, which was that for many years, there was the code of silence around these events because the Miners' March was illegal. Many of the participants were later tried for treason in Charlestown. There was a code that people didn't talk about it. And, 5 decades later, people were finally ready to talk. The timing was good for it. I would talk with someone who would say something like, well, he's dead anyways, so I guess I can talk about him. So I think the timing was good, and it has not escaped me that I was talking to people about something that happened 50 years ago, 50 years earlier, and now I'm sitting here talking about something I did 50 years earlier. But that's the answer. I did a lot of listening, and I think older people want to talk, and I would encourage you to ask your older relatives about their experiences as young adults. They may very well be pleased to speak with you.
I'll just add to that. You can see a poster over here. Help us tell the story that lives within you. The West Virginia Mine Wars Museum is actively gathering oral histories and really any kind of artifact of the mine wars. So if somebody in the audience has a story they want to share about their family, go to wvminewars.org, our museum's website, and get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. So, yeah.
So we have three amazing writers that did amazing scholarship in regards to the mine wars. Why do you think it is that being West Virginia, one of the only states in the union that requires a full year of education in our history, do so few West Virginians actually know about? And what can we do to better that moving forward?
Read chapter 5 of my book that addresses that very question. All right. The reason we have West Virginia history in the classroom of the 8th grade, West Virginia Studies, or the Golden Horseshoe Prep class. Some of you might know it, where you learn the counties in alphabetical order. You learn that Mary Lou Retton was the first lady on a Wheaties cereal box. You know, all the important stuff. That Chuck Yeager wrote the sound barrier. Right, that's what you learn, right? The reason we have West Virginia history is because of a guy by the name of Phil Conley. Phil Conley was the creator of the American Constitutional Association, and it was intended to create a pro-industry version of historical events. And so we have West Virginia studies taught to shape the perception that West Virginians had about the state, and for that to be controlled by the industry. Okay, so from the get-go, it wasn't to teach you history, it was to control the information that you received. Okay, so that's one big reason why it was, and they took great lengths to make sure that this didn't make its way into the textbooks. And if read chapter 5 of my book, there's a paper trail. I'm not just showing you where it was absent. I've got the letters that show where governors said this can't go into the books. So it was systematically and deliberately left out. Now it's in textbooks now. That some places it's taught, some places it's not taught. It depends on the teacher. And also, I think you have a lot of West Virginia history teachers in high school perhaps aren't. That's not really their focus. Like my West Virginia studies teacher was also the Spanish teacher, and they only gave it to her because they didn't have anybody else to teach it. And so sometimes that happens too, because we're understaffed here in West Virginia. So that's why.
I'll plug again the Miners Museum, which Chuck is also a part of with me, and we have developed a curriculum for the three different grades that West Virginia Studies is taught. So if you're a teacher in the audience and you'd like to access those, just go to our website again, wvminewars.org. They're not to brag, but they're like pretty cool. They're really fun, and I think really educational, very interactive. So check those out. Yes.
Thank you very much. Great. I had several questions. I'm just going to restrict it to one though, about changes that maybe took place between the time of the Pine Creek, Cabin Creek strike, and the Battle of Blair Mountain and the decade on our students. I was curious about the impact of the war. You would have had a lot of people from the people who had gone into the broader world, gotten out of the local environment, came back with obviously combat experience, but then also maybe they kind of fight for their country and came back, put up with the same things they were. Can you think of that? And anybody, I guess.
Yeah, at the end of the Pink Creek, Cabin Creek strike, it pretty much ended with a settlement that was not very satisfactory to the miners. A lot of the rank and file were not happy with how the union leaders, especially at the national level, were handling things. They basically, went back to work, but not very happily. So, a lot of these same gripes and conditions continued over the years. The union efforts did not stop. They were still trying to recruit people into the union. The leadership were trying to, grassroots. Yeah.
Maybe I should just clarify. When I said the war, I meant World War I.
Right, and that absolutely had a good, big impact. for several reasons. And when when World War I occurred, of course, there was, coal mining took off, and there was a huge demand for the coal, for the iron, for weapons and so forth. And that had a lot to do with the conditions and the economics and, what happened to kind of contribute to the difficulties that, went on in 1919, 1920, 1921. And like you said, a lot of those men came back from and with some, military training, and they did apply those skills and equipment to the 1920-21 mine war as well.
Many of the retired miners I interviewed had fought in World War I. They were military veterans. They had military training. And the formations during the Battle of Blair Mountain, they organized themselves into military-like formations. They drew on that experience. The other point I'd make about it is that many of the miners who fought in the Battle of Blair Mountain were extremely patriotic men. And you probably know that the Battle of Blair Mountain ended when the President of the United States, Warren Harding, sent in the U.S. Army to break up the fight. The miners essentially walked away from the fight at that point because they were unwilling to fight the U.S. Army.
I guess it's my turn. Yeah, both of those points all those points are very good. Couple of things, while the war was going on, the UNWA had a very successful organizing drive in the state. So they organized the whole state except for 3 counties, Logan, Mingo, McDowell. So they were extremely successful during the war. So it was those 3 counties that remained. Also, the leadership of the Creek, Cabin Creek strike, Petrie, they were now leaders movement in the state. And they took those militant actions, which were effective and worked for them in Paint Creek, Cabin Creek, and applied them to Logan, Mingo, and McDowell. And I guess, as you said, their experiences in the war, miners were exempt from the draft. They didn't have to go. A lot of miners went because they felt they had a better chance of survival going to fight than they did working in a West Virginia coal mine. But the rhetoric of World War I, make the world safe for democracy, was Woodrow Wilson's calling card, right? And so they go to France to make the world safe for democracy, and they come back and you have a mine foreman filling out your own ballot on voting day, election day. Okay, so they had to take up arms again to make West Virginia safe for democracy. So they realized the ideals that they were fighting for in France, they had to fight for them here. And I should also point out that it's today, September 4th, was the day that they surrendered to federal troops. This was the day 100 years ago that the Battle of Blair Mountain ended. So
Great question.
it was.
Yeah.
Question for Ms. Lawrence. As you reflect on your interview conversations, do you find that the interviews you recorded in 1972 helped, as you capture these workers' histories, did it help younger miners and younger members of their family embrace small d democracy within the union? And do you also think from any follow-up contact that recording these interviews help these stories survive the generations?
That's such a wonderful question. I would be thrilled if the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren of the people I interviewed found this book and learned something about their ancestors. This is the first time these interviews have been published. It's 50 years later. So have they had a huge impact on the younger members of that family? I don't think so, not yet, but I hope they will. If you know any, please pass them along. It's a wonderful question. They had an impact on young scholars. I'm happy to hear that, Chuck.
I realize many of them didn't have the
Yeah, the question is, fast forward to the 1990s. What relics or remnants of this history were available or within the descendants of the participants?
Yeah, what did they have the knowledge of?
Did it come down in the family? Yeah.
I think we can only speculate. I don't think that there's a full-on explanation for that. A lot of people that I've come across growing up, there's a lot of fear associated with you don't want to say anything that's going to upset the balance, or you don't want to say anything anti-cult, because so there's a lot of fear, and I don't know whether has descendants or not. I say in my book that a lot of aspects of life in contemporary Appalachia reflect the consequences of erased history. And so I don't know. That's a good question. It's a work of fiction, so you figure that out. Yeah. Yeah.
The Keeney endorsement.
The first recreation of the march.
I think it was like 96.
96, maybe somebody in the audience knows, but there was a recreation march early, way before we did ours in 2011, and it got a lot of attention. Thank you. It got a lot of attention, and there was a lot of pushback, and in fact, there was some violence in that march. So I have to think that at that time, those media reports would have been perhaps awakening or dredging up some of the memories or family histories. Again, speculation, but it was kind of in the headlines, starting to be in mid 90s. Yeah.
I know that it's been 100 years, and it seems like there was a labor movement 100 years ago in West Virginia. I'm not going to say it's lost their way, but there's been this push for right to work in the legislature, and there's been 100 years and things have drastically changed from then. Do you have any insight into that, and like why we completely moved away from unionization and from where we started into where we are now?
So is there a through line between back then and where we are now as a right to work state?
I'll just say it's not just West Virginia. I'm from Tennessee, and it's really, really bad there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we have to recognize that today in West Virginia, the face of the union movement is no longer a bearded burly man in a coal mine. Perhaps controversial, but I would say it's the face of women service workers in West Virginia, particularly those who work in public service, and teachers and school employees, which we saw in 2018, that incredible of power and energy and frustration at the teacher strike. And many of those teachers, bandanas, in fact, they invented their own color coding for bandanas. I think the bus drivers were yellow bandanas, and there was a blue set of bandanas. I don't remember what that was for. I talked to many of the teachers at that time. Amongst the teachers, these were not all people on the left. I mean, they did bring up their own family heritage with the mine wars and the Battle of Blair Mountain. There were Mother Jones signs everywhere. People were spouting and quoting Mother Jones all the time. UMWA actually was front and center at the big rally. Their big camo tent was sitting right there, and they had officers came and spoke. And so I got the sense that there was a remarkable degree of solidarity between the kind of old timers of the union movement here and the kind of new face of the labor in West Virginia, being the majority of whom being women in the public service sector. So yeah, I don't know, does that help? That's not quite answering your question. I think how did we get here today? I'm writing a book that's sort of about that. In fact, but I think the easy answer is like, there is no like easy through trajectory. Any more questions?
Can you repeat the question?
My second question was, what makes you passionate about writing about this, and when did you kind of realize that this was an undertold story that needed to be amplified? Is that a fair? Chuck's got a prop.
No. Yeah, that's a pretty easy question for me to answer because the book, Never Justice, Never Peace, is a completion of my father had started to write. My dad grew up in Charleston and he wrote Thunder in the Mountains about the Blair Mountain, or Megon and the Blair Mountain Battle and so forth. And then he had started to write this but didn't finish it. And so, I kind of came at it through that door instead of through a passion for history, which actually I hated history in high school. The way they taught it, and maybe they still, I don't know, but I love history now. But yeah, my dad growing up in Charleston said the same thing. It's, he hardly ever heard about this stuff. He knew, felt when he started digging into it, he knew that it was a story that needed to be told, that, there wasn't enough out there about it. And it should be a history that the state of West Virginia is not ashamed of. It's the message, this is something that should be broadcast. So I guess that's all.
My oral history was supported by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It was a special grant program for young people under the age of 30. I was not the original grant recipient. The original grant recipient was the Miners' Voice, which was the newspaper of the Miners for Democracy movement. The through line there is that the Miners for Democracy wanted to recapture that heritage of union militants for their own movement. They wanted these stories to be told for the present generation of that era in the early 1970s, which led to a successful movement to overthrow the leadership of Tony Boyle in the United Mine Workers Union and to bring in a new era of union democracy and fighting for the rights and for the contracts and for the health care of coal miners. So that was the motivation. Then I was very fortunate to have been invited by the Miners for Democracy and by my dear friend who worked in the MFD, who is here today, who invited me to come and apply for that job of doing oral history. So that was the through line there. And there was a connection between the militancy of the 1920s and the militancy of the 1970s.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with Frederick Barton's book. I wanted to get a little bit of you guys are and ways of making right or Keeney and the whole model of Blair Mountain, 1912, 1921. How much do you think? I'll say socialism, small s, not necessarily the Socialist Party, And then also, sorry, third question. On the historiography of this, as the sort of social connection, it's kind of been erased. Or they not there? Yeah.
Well, okay, I don't think I'll answer all of your questions, but I'll start on chipping away at it. So definitely socialism as a party as well as a movement was a big motivator. You know, I mean, the miners would, they would get injured and they, instead of getting any workers' comp or insurance or, you know, help of any kind, they lost their jobs and had to move out of their company-owned homes because they got injured on the job. You know, and they saw that kind of treatment happen all the time, and they knew it was wrong, and they knew it was because, you know, the owners just were interested in making money, and that was it. And so, you know, they turned to socialism as I thought a more just route. Mother Jones was, she would say that she said, I'm not a socialist as, you know, in the Socialist Party, but she believed in the movement and you know, the just treatment that they found in that movement. They knew that capitalism was cheating them, and I think that's all.
All right, socialism in Pink Creek and Cabin Creek, one of the reasons why it was appealing to the miners is that the socialists advocated for direct action for violence, and the socialists encouraged the miners to grab their guns, and the Socialist Party helped supply guns to the miners. When the UMWA leadership, and I'm talking about the elected leadership at the time, not the rank and file in Pink Creek and Cabin Creek, were afraid to go into Cabin Creek and were afraid of the mine guards. So socialism, on one hand, was a means to an end to them because they would supply them with the guns that they needed to fight. Of course, there were a few socialist mayors in the area. Mayor Vestdale on Cabin Creek was a socialist. You had a socialist mayor in Parkersburg, one in Star City, near Morgantown. So it enabled the miners to find an outlet. And also, they had to turn to socialism in Pink Cabin Creek because by that time, both Democratic parties and Republican parties have been subverted by the coal industry. And that remains pretty consistent to the present day. Not fully consistent, but I mean, the coal industry has controlled both parties in this state for decades upon decades upon decades. And so, as Frank Keeney said, there's no difference between a Democrat and a Republican in West Virginia because they all do whatever the coal industry wants them to do. So it provided an alternate option for them. You know, whether they were well versed in theoretical socialism, no. There may have been a couple of them that were, but for the most part, no, they hadn't read Marx for a few of them. I mean, Fred Mooney did, but most of them hadn't. If you're talking post-World War I and Red Scare, it's much more of impacting the reactionary, meaning that's why the American Constitutional Association was created in part by Phil Connolly, as I was mentioning earlier, is they wanted to control school curriculum because they were afraid of socialism. And they worried, or they thought that unionism was kind of a gateway drug to Marx. And therefore, if people joined a union, the next thing they know, they'll be taking their orders from Moscow. So they needed to nip that in the bud by controlling the school curriculum. So the way the Red Scare impacted things in West Virginia was actually the powers that be working hard to get rid of all unionism because they felt that that was going to lead potentially to socialism, which I don't think that that's true, by the way, but that's one of the things that they feared.
That's a great question. I'm so sorry, but it's 3:30, so I'm going to have to close this down. I want to deeply thank the West Virginia University Humanities Center. This is one of our sponsors. Renee is here webcasting for us, as well as West Virginia University Press. And please, as a reminder, we have so many goodies for you over on this table. Books, and we have a history in it. You'll learn so much, and it's complimentary. We also have luscious snacks, so go take advantage. The authors are available here to sign your books after you purchase them. And I'm sure they'd love to continue this with you. And thank you so much for coming. This is a fantastic